Hello, can you hear me? Hello. Today I'm introducing DIGSAU, Mark and Jamie from DIGSAU. They're the practice based in Philly, guided by a commitment to design excellence, and today they're going to be in a deep connection to the material culture of the places they work. They have a broad view of architecture with many different types of projects, and today they are going to be guiding us through them based on building walls. Here I go.
Yeah, here you go. All right, thank you. All right, hello everybody. Thank you. Bear with us. I'm going to introduce. I'm Jamie Unkefer. I'm one of the founding principals from DIGSAU. I'm here with my colleague Mark Sanderson, who's another founding principal, and we're going to talk to you today about building walls. Before jumping in, I just want to say how much we have appreciated our visit to Virginia Tech into the School of Architecture, and how impressed we are. First of all, how gracious our hosts have been, but also how impressed we have been with the character and the energy of the school that we've seen. The just really compelling work, and in particular the kind of craft of model building and of drawing, and for us it's especially refreshing in a profession that is more and more driven by digital tools. It's a joy to see so many hand drawings and different forms of creative work. That said, we did use ChatGPT to write this lecture, so please bear with us. And as I said, we're going to talk about building walls today and what that means for us as a firm. And by building walls, we see it both as the kind of the finished product and how that finished product relates materially or contextually to its surrounding, but also the act of constructing a wall and what that means to us as a firm and our process and the process that we've gone through in our work. So we'll share some stories about projects that we think relate to that idea. I'm going to start with a quote from Loger, which this 18th century philosopher. And for us, this is really an interesting quote. It is kind of, a little down on walls. And I think what's interesting is this is really kind of foreshadows what became, particularly in the kind of modern architectural world, a sentiment that, thank you, Mark, that you can see sort of embodied in a lot of the thinking. Like, obviously, this is Philip Johnson's sort of iconic glass house. And there's just an embrace of glass and transparency that, a real shift from earlier forms of expression in architecture to something that is much more about transparency. And we, by all means, embrace transparency in our work. But transparency also sort of abdicates that sort of plane of material between the interior and the exterior. It sort of permeates the interior or reflects the exterior without really taking a position. And so in our work, I think, really, I would say fundamentally, we don't agree with Loger. We're really interested in walls and the textures of walls, how you move through walls, who inhabits the walls, how you puncture the walls, what the walls are made of, what the materials are, where they come from, how the materials age, how weather impacts the materials, how walls kind of divide spaces, both on land and underwater, how walls are kind of construed in given contexts, how walls evolve with the landscapes. This is a little sort of one-room schoolhouse that we completed at an arboretum just outside of Philadelphia, which was built entirely out of terracotta. And the thinking there, and we're hoping to see how it works out, is that these walls will kind of evolve as a landscape element and just continue to get better with age. And for us, that's a really important part of the exploration that we do as a firm. And of course, how walls are built and who's building them and how we engage with those that we collaborate with.
So I think getting into the making of these walls, I think we've all seen diagrams and drawings of traditional wall construction and construction that, as what's on the screen here, the Palladian diagrams of a wall and that construction, which is made by one mason, one hand, all the way through from outside to inside. The interior might have some elements to it, but it's one monolithic wall. And the development of our walls today are not that. They're sometimes made up from 90% air, not mass. This is a layered construction. It can be debated how you make a wall one way or the other, what's the right way, where do the layers go, but this is something that's in the constructive logic of today, and it's built into everything we do. And our area of influence as architects is often left to the very thinnest layer on the outside of these buildings, maybe sometimes on the inside, but that's our area of influence. And it's an area that is increasingly being developed and pushed towards manufactured products. So our work is very often pushed towards a selection process where you're picking manufactured materials that are going to be assembled in a particular way, and our area of influence is, quite frankly, has been reduced over time through this kind of manufacturing. And I think that's something that we really, as Jamie was talking about our visit here and walking through the studio and just kind of getting the essence of the place, it's very clearly there's a sense of making, of the hand and connection. I think Sharon was talking about the earliest kind of conception of the school here, and really backed some of the thoughts about Bauhaus, but really binding it to the act of making. And for us, that's something that we are very connected to. And so when we think about walls in Philadelphia in particular, it's something that is very prevalent. Our most typical housing type is the row house. So we share walls. These are walls that are structured. We share structure between the houses. The grid of the city has really taken hold over from the earliest times of William Penn, and we have all sorts of influences from Frank Furness, who has really kind of, his work has influenced much of the architecture in Philadelphia, and certainly Lucan and Venturi, but even more so tying back into the making and the locale and the place of where we are from, the geology, the quarrying of the material, where it comes from, how it's logged and acquired, and then back to the making, the manufacturing culture in Philadelphia. The act of making is one that is really prevalent. It's a blue collar city, and it's the essence and the sense of making is very prevalent. And for us, this is a picture of our studio environment. We actually inhabit and work in one of those old warehouses and manufacturing facilities, and it's very much a studio culture, one where we work together, we pin up, that was something that was very important for the four of us when we founded the firm back in the earliest days, and has continued on through.
I will say that the image of the office that you just saw is not reflective of the actual condition of the space most of the time.
It's more like your studio.
It's more like your studios, which we embrace. So we're going to start and talk through some projects, and we're going to keep track of time just to make sure that we're able to kind of get everyone out in a reasonable time. This is the first project that our firm completed. This is really the project that we used to sort of launch the firm. It's the Construction Training and Education Center in Wilmington, Delaware. It is a nonprofit that works with at-risk kids, teaching them the construction trades while providing social services and helping to mentor them towards completing their GED. And for us, this was the process of getting to know this client and understanding what their resources were. And of course, like really all of our nonprofit clients, they had no money. Money was definitely not something that they had. But what they did have was an abundance of reclaimed material. They had, over the course of the history of the program, they had done a lot of sort of deconstruction work of warehouses in and around Wilmington, and like old pickle barrels from a Vlasic plant that had been abandoned. And they had a lot of trainee labor, unskilled trainee labor. And so the project was conceived as a component of the curriculum of the program. And from the structural frame of the building, where all the connections were bolted connections so that trainees could literally work with the fabricator and erector assembling the steel frame, to the, setting the carriages in the foundation work. And then the facade is probably the most, notable characteristic. That was conceived kind of as a quilting bee, which kind of took the hands of a lot of individuals within the community and brought them together around a shared project. And so we conceived of the facade as a kind of series of 47 3/4 by 47 3/4 inch panels, where an individual trainee with really no experience could come in and, using pretty much just a chop saw and a screw gun, could build panels. And the only parameters were that it had to fit within that 27 or 47, we'll call it 48 by 48 grid. And then these panels, this is one of the early ones created using whatever variety of materials that trainee found. Those panels were gradually assembled and installed as components of the facade as a rain screen, so in front of the water barrier and the insulation. And this is the end product of that effort. And it's for us, and I'll show you some of the interior shots. It is a shop which is functioning, continuing to function, as they actually still haven't finished the building. It's now 15 years later, but it continues to serve their program very effectively. And you can see here, I think one of the things that we're most proud of and influenced us maybe more than anything in our careers is just how much that engagement and that sort of collaboration in the making of this building brought a sense of ownership to everybody that was involved in the process, and how much it compelled that organization to a higher level.
And I'm just going to jump in with a little ad lib. I think really doubling down on the fact of the influence. I think one of the things that we have really recognized is that we're evolving in terms of our thinking as architects, and our clients and the projects we work on are reciprocating and influencing us, and none more so than this particular project, which we were, kind of fostered in an environment where, as architects, it was very much about control. We were trying to control the end product, trying to control the details, trying to control exactly how the materials were assembled, and if they weren't assembled exactly how we had envisioned, that was something we would either work against to try to make them follow our directions, or would reject the work, et cetera. So there's a culture of that in the architectural field, of that kind of pushing towards full resolution. And this was a moment in time where, as a young firm growing, we began to recognize that end control of every aspect and every piece of the work was maybe not always the best. And we began to recognize that other voices, other fingers, other kind of imperfections in the work, there was great opportunity in that, and real texture and soulfulness and engagement that was really palpable. And so I think from that moment on, it really changed the trajectory of our design sensibilities to one that we are very much constantly thinking about who is making the designs. How are they making it? How are their hands involved, or the machinery that they're working with? But what are the implications of that, and where are those imperfections which are in opposition to the kind of perfection and manufactured world that we're walking through, where places are very similar. You see the same kind of strip malls, the same kind of big box stores, the sameness everywhere. And how are we kind of working to reveal the idiosyncrasies of the people in the world around us?
Really going off script there, Mark. This is the little conclusion of this particular story. We have had a very rich and ongoing relationship with the Challenge Program. We are currently working on this new enterprise that they've evolved into, which is a furniture business. It's related to the program. It basically hires trainees and works with them to develop, to build furniture, really beautiful custom furniture. And the building itself is a timber frame structure that they've been constructing, and it's really phenomenal. It's like a cathedral to woodworking for us. We took our office down there and spent a day trying to kind of help out and just getting everybody excited about such a unique way of building. Here's everybody oiling the tenons and driving them into the posts. Just kind of like an extraordinary experience for us. But the next project I'm going to tell you about is another relatively early project, I think completed in about 2014. This is similar, and so it's a similar theme. This was a project for Swarthmore College. Swarthmore College is a small liberal arts college just outside of Philadelphia. A really great client, a very kind of enlightened client. This was a kind of off-the-radar project for them, a design-build project that they asked us to participate in. It is a fitness center, basically, for the college. And their campus is defined, I guess maybe like Virginia Tech, by an array of stone buildings, but stone buildings from a lot of different eras, different styles, there are different stones, not one stone. The area that we were worked in, however, is across the railroad tracks and is really defined more by red roofs and kind of low-cost block walls. It's kind of their athletic campus. I will say they're not a school that had a high priority on athletics historically. It's an older Quaker school. But this is the building that was being kind of repurposed. It was being demolished, but one of the missions was to salvage everything we could to reuse in the building. So it was an old squash court building, and for whatever reason, people weren't playing squash. I think they changed the dimensions of the squash courts, which threw everybody for a loop. And we were able to salvage all this incredible maple that was then kind of maple that was both in the floors and in the walls, was then kind of repurposed throughout the project. So on the interior, you see like a lot of floors that were the former squash court floors, or kind of framed, or even as far as a donor wall that reused an old door. And the partie for the building was a really simple concept. It was adjacent to this very lovely wooded area on the campus. And so we just kind of picked up on the basic kind of landscape elements of this ground, this kind of denser ground plane, and this understory of forest, and then a canopy. And we use that to kind of divide the three programmatic elements for the project. So we have on the ground floor the kind of weights area, the kind of team training spaces. In the kind of understory space, this highly glazed space, we have the fitness area, and then there's kind of multi-purpose kind of dance studio space on the third floor. And we developed the wall systems around that idea, this kind of tripartite idea. The understory was easy. There was a donor who was willing to give all this curtain wall for the project, so that was taken care of. The red panels were something we struggled with a little more. They were sort of budgeted as stucco, and we thought that we would try to elevate the quality a little bit beyond that. And so we sort of delved into what we've now termed supply-side design, which means we went around to a bunch of manufacturers and begged them for materials and told them that, if they give us if they could work with our budget, we'd do whatever we can to kind of promote their material and ask them to help us to understand how to use it most efficiently. So we came up with a kind of 12 by 4 panel system. One of the things that we found out from them is that they have a real hard time. This happened to be a company that was just coming from Europe into the US, and they bought this idea that this would be a good project to kind of launch their US business. They're based in Pittsburgh, and they had this high strength concrete panel. One of the problems that they had was that the color was really inconsistent, and so they ended up having to reject a lot of panels. They weren't cutting it in their quality control, and we said, we're fine with that. We don't really want you to reject them. Actually, we kind of prefer the variability, and so we created, again, kind of like in the challenge program, we created a structure which kind of allowed for that variation in color to kind of exist and gave some general direction to the contractor that we were working with on how they would be installed. And then you can see how we use this material, which is typically kind of installed in a very planar way. And I think, frankly, looks a little flat and lifeless and, a lot like most of the cement panel wall systems that you see now. And just by kind of introducing the Z-girt, which kind of pushed out the system and created this kind of variation, this kind of chiaroscuro on the facade, I think we got a lot more out of it. And as the light passes over it, I think it becomes a much more animated building element. And then for this project, the last part, and maybe the most interesting part of the story for us, was the base. And the base was the original concrete foundation. We were having a really hard time within the budget trying to figure out how we would clad it. And one of the things that we discovered in the woods behind this project was this incredible mine, they called it the boneyard, where they had been dumping for the last 150 years all the stone relics of all the buildings. So you can see the balustrades from the original college building. There was a William Rahn building that had dumped all this Swiss Valspar. And we said, hey, can we use this material? And they said, sure, why not? And so we here again, we teamed with them. It's one of the things we've learned in this kind of, to Mark's point, is that you can actually talk people into doing a lot more than you think. You just have to find the right person and make the right case. In this case, we talked the mason into working with us to catalog the material that was usable, and we kind of worked with them to figure out how we would lay it up. There wasn't enough of any one stone to do the whole base, so we came up with this concept that sort of created this stratigraphy of different types of stone, this kind of pattern. And if my colleague Jules, our partner, were here, he'd relate it to aleatoric music. For anybody that's the kind of music person here, it's sort of create this structure for the musicians. John Cage, I guess, or John Cale. This is why I shouldn't bring this up. Anyway, it's sort of create a structure that within the structure, the individual musicians have a lot of latitude in how they interpret the composition. And that's kind of the theory of this wall. The idea was that we sort of created some guidelines around how the stone would be used, and then we really entrusted the masons to kind of execute in a way. And this kind of awesome guy who was, skeptical at first, and by the end, and the completion of the project, was bringing his grandchildren to share with them the kind of wall that he had been so instrumental in constructing. And we think, through that collaboration, we were able to get a lot more out of it than we would have been if we just settled for what was being asked for. I'll pass that to you.
Okay, so the next project is one that really wrapped up over the last couple of years. It was a real struggle through the pandemic to get this project built, but it is for a nonprofit that is called the Clay Studio. It's one of the only kind of dedicated nonprofit art studios really focused on ceramic art in the country. And so it has a a national and even an international kind of reputation and footprint, and they bring artists from all over the world to come and teach and be visiting artists, but then they also work with the community and local artists as a studio space. So this is a project located in the kind of the north, I guess, east part of Philadelphia, and certainly surrounded. This is a historic image of a building that's literally right across the street, still there today, but it's very much this kind of warehouse manufacturing facility context. And so we were certainly inspired in responding to that, but at the same time, we were asking ourselves, how do we actually, from this kind of it's a very tight site, full build, edge to edge at every, no setbacks for the building other than a bit on the back for light and windows. But how do we reflect both the sense of making and what happens in that building, and the sense of kind of mass and texture and the handcraft that goes into the making of ceramics when you throw it, where there's a volumetric aspect to it and something that, with a flat exterior warehouse surface, how do we begin to speak to that? And another aspect of the making and of ceramics is the process itself. And this is a place that we often mine and think about as we are in the design process, but this is one where the process of making ceramics, not all, but in many cases, there's a two-phase firing process where initially you go through the first firing, which is a bisqueware. It's kind of a brittle, rather consistent color of the clay, and then you go through the glazing process at the end. So there's variability in those moments, and it's also something that we thought was an interesting play on how we might use the sensibilities and those materials to reflect in the building. So the exterior of our building is very much reflective of that kind of first phase, that bisqueware, and there are interior and special spots within the building which we used a more expensive glazed tile brick and kind of built on that. We went through a variety and exhaustive series of studies of how to articulate and design this facade in a way that begins to the rendering on the upper left there is where we ended up, and it has there'll be an image at the end that shows some definitive connectivity to that. But the process of actually bringing that volume and that sense of mass to light in what is actually a thin veneer brick wall, so a full 4-inch, but a brick wall nonetheless that is veneer, and all the various components of learning what it means to corbel bricks in terms of what the allowable amount of span is, what is the maximum prescriptive versus engineering that wall, as you can see on the two diagrams on the right, kind of going through that. Really delving into what is on the left-hand side there, the typical kind of cavity wall construction where the brick is held out and you have kind of a smooth planar version, where we eventually evolved to a wall that has mass and thickness in itself in the backup wall. So the exterior volumetric aspects of that wall are expressed in the backup wall, and that allowed for use of more standard brick and brick ties and brick materials, but also was facilitating what was for the brick layers and the masons the ability to kind of understand and track their progress against a consistent backup wall. I will say the mock-up process was one of, you can kind of see in progressive steps from early mock-ups on the left, and you can kind of see that trying to get that diagonal transition in the brick was something they were really struggling with. And so we began to, this is a moment in time where we were really prescribing exactly how we wanted them to handle that edge and that brick condition. And what we learned Then we said, nope, let's try it with where you would work the transitions in the middle with those much smaller elements. And that was kind of came with a disastrous effect in our mind. And at a certain point, we just said, how about we just tell you what we want, which is run this at a diagonal and a straight diagonal up to the window from the lower corner, and you use your typical masonry techniques to do that. And lo and behold, that's what worked. Here's an image of the construction, which you can kind of, I think what we like about this image is that you can see the thinness of that brick and that kind of the veil of the brick as it moves up, but then in its final articulation, it's one that has some of that volumetric aspects of the brick. You can kind of see the play of light and shadow along it. Big, open, well-lit, day-lit studio space. Again, very simple construction, one where the cubbies on the inside of the space are part of that ornament and the articulation of the space. You can kind of see multi-generational involvements in that. And then on the lower level, much more of a public facing. They had both kind of a very, an art gift shop, one where artists would sell on consignment their pieces. There was a gallery there, but again, so you can see some of these multi-purpose spaces, which is a garage, but also an event space on the lower level. So they would clean that out at various points, and they hold community events and various events there. But then also on the upper level, connectivity back to the city through an open deck space. So this is seen it in its context with an artist mural that Philadelphia is kind of renowned for that. And there's that final image, which really does speak, I think, successfully back to some of those initial renderings. So this project, the next project is quite a departure. And it's a departure in that this is a campground, Base Camp Delta. It's in West Virginia. And I'm going to move through this one a little more quickly. Very large, the Bechtel Reserve, they kind of strip mining. They really scarified the land here and created a place that was, recovering slowly. And this is where the national jubilee for Boy Scouts come every year. 50,000 Boy Scouts, believe it or not. Maybe some of you have been there before, but hard to imagine 50,000 sweaty Boy Scouts camping out there for a couple of weeks, but that's what would happen every 4 years. And so this was a headquarter building and a pavilion for that. And I think for us, this was a building that we were really just trying to connect to some of the basics of very simple construction, and then at moments try to find moments of kind of exuberance and folly. And the undersoffit of this very much is reflective of the hillscape and the mountainscape in the distance. Simple wall construction details that at moments find kind of a playful transition and movement through that. Interior, very much an inside-outside building where the interior just, again, takes on this tough, simple construction with plywood, extremely large openings and portals to the exterior, but a real focus on how do we use what is there, in this case, conduit, as ornament, and how do we work with the contractors to take those simple elements, just do it in a thoughtful way that also reflects some of that connectivity to the act of making. And then each one of these base camps would have a different color associated with it. So that's where that orange coloring goes. And this pavilion has that orange stripe, which identifies due north on the site, which is something that's relevant for the campers.
Not that Boy Scouts didn't have compasses. These next two projects are actually a little bit different. They have many of the same qualities of the previous projects that we showed, but they're really focused on walls in a sense as a programmatic element, kind of an element that is responding to very sort of specific circumstance. So you'll see in a second. This is another nonprofit project just outside of Philadelphia, and You can see the city just on the horizon there. It is a former reservoir. It was actually part of a complex of reservoirs that was being decommissioned by the water department. It is the largest still water body of water in Philadelphia, but nobody knew it was there. It was just this incredible unknown resource, but the birds knew it was there, and it had become a really critical path of in the migratory path of birds through the area. You can see here, these are the images of the original construction of the reservoir. It was completely man-made, kind of, you know, all manual labor back in the 1800s. This kind of great active infrastructure, which over time had been subsumed by nature in this really profound way, in a way that had created what by all measures felt like a completely naturalistic landscape, and one that was really buried. So it had been shut off from the community maybe 30 years ago. I grew up maybe 15 blocks from there and had no idea it existed. It was just this really profound sense of discovery. The Audubon Society managed to talk the city into not draining it any further, and it became the site for the headquarters that would house Audubon and Outward Bound, which was for us. They were our clients, and they're a really interesting pairing. On the one hand, the Outward Bound folks, they both have a love and appreciation of nature. The Outward Bound folks like to get into nature, climb things, you know, make a lot of noise. And Audubon, they're really focused on silence and watching birds. So there was an inherent sort of paradox in the client group and in the mission of the space, which we, you know, was interesting. We tried to capture. These are some early renderings, and you can kind of see here the basic idea was to restore the area of the berm that had been excavated in the effort to drain the reservoir, and to preserve this sense of kind of wonderment, of discovery, as you kind of walk from the parking lot, which is pretty far away, up to the site. You can see the plan here. So it's very simple partie. It's got this 350-foot-long wall that kind of defines the edge, and these simple program elements kind of build off of that. So here you're looking at it from the road down below, and again, this sense of arrival, of coming through this portal and seeing this body of water, kind of ascending to this body of water, was part of the experience that we were really trying to capture. And the material that we chose to use, we actually worked here with the challenge program, because whenever we hit a problem that we can't solve through conventional construction contractors, we go to the challenge program and talk them into helping us out. In this case, we were using a technique called a technique of preserving, sort of an ancient Japanese technique of preserving wood. It's called shishugaban, and it basically consists of charring either cypress or cedar and oiling it to preserve it and to keep it, to make it more insect resistant. So you can see here the challenge program team assembling the panels. We wanted to create a wall that was not just a kind of programmatic element, you know, defining the space, but also something that became bird habitat as well. And so the little boxes that you see kind of along the facade were all designed with the Audubon folks' input to try to facilitate, you know, to be attractive to, it's like a motel, to be attractive to birds. It hasn't gotten as much traction as we had hoped, but that's the spirit of this. And the other thing that we've become increasingly focused on in our practice, and something that this project was really focused on, is not killing birds through the use of glass, which is actually a huge issue, especially in the urban areas where glass is such a predominant building material. So we tried to make it more of a demonstration project where we're using, on the one hand, you can see on the left-hand side of the photo, a kind of more high-tech frit that's installed, and on the right-hand side, this very simple, just basic cable structure sort of strung through eyelets to create the effect of, well, to keep birds from running into the glass, but also to create what we think is kind of an interesting effect, both on the interior and the exterior. And I think that same thinking was carried through all the details you can see here. I'll skip over them a little bit in the interest of time. This is the donor wall, which is also glazed, but kind of maintains that same spacing. And then this gate, which was this fantastic collaboration with a local iron worker who created something that we think is really unique and beautiful. And so I'm going to talk about one more project. It looks like we're more or less on time here, Mark. This last project is also about the kind of programmatic nature of a wall and how, and really thinking about it very specifically, we can solve some problems. In this case, it's another project for Swarthmore College. They had this really interesting site. Here's a diagram kind of, I'll skip over, it shows all the different, they're very committed to sustainability. This was the first project they did with their new sustainability guidelines. It's a net zero building with a lot of different attributes that they were sort of exploring to create their framework for being a more sustainable campus. The challenge of the site was this is kind of place out in the corner of the campus, pretty far removed from the main campus. It was sort of defined by the baseball field, their baseball field, which was also this kind of, forlorn baseball field, and several kind of historic buildings that were being used as residence halls. And this was a competition that we participated in. And our solution really, it was a problem that was vexing. It was a problem that was vexing the university. They couldn't figure out how to kind of use this space. The conflict between these two uses, the athletics and the residential halls, was for them kind of insurmountable. And our solution was to actually embrace that and to say, hey, this is not a problem. This is an opportunity. There's this moment where these two worlds can come together, and the outfield wall can be this major component of the student residential building. And for us, this was great because we're all baseball fans, and it gave us the chance to study every urban baseball field that we could think of, and just think about the kind of variation in dimensions, which is one of the great things about the sport, and that it has this opportunity to kind of bend to the existing conditions. And we studied the trajectory of home runs because, of course, there was a lot of concern on the administration's part that we'd be subjecting their building to home runs. And this is the final product. And you can see this outfield wall becomes a really important part of the experience of the building. Here, looking at it from another angle, and here's the student lounge on the ground floor. So this is the view that they have at the baseball field, which I think on every level has been a pretty successful relationship. And I think it came through this very poignant moment where this wall divided these two programmatic zones and actually brought them together. I'll go a little bit quickly through this. We had this other side of the building that we had to deal with too. We broke the massing of the building down into these smaller units to try to relate more to these existing historic buildings. They have a really interesting nature, this kind of slate roofs and these stone bases that influenced our thinking. We have obviously a very different type of construction. This is the wall section for these buildings, which is because of its net zero criteria, has these super insulated walls that, kind of the depth of a Palladian wall, but mostly air, but of course a place that could be inhabited by students. And we took the shingled roofs from the adjacent properties and used them for the wall material. And obviously that was part of an economic decision that was being made because it's a more economical material, but also one that we thought had a very interesting kind of relationship to the context. At the base of the building, there were actual sort of slate sculpting, so slate that's kind of full dimensional stone. And one little subtle detail for those that care about little subtle details, in order to deal with the kind of discrepancies in the stone and the kind of coursing of the stone sculptings, we proposed using those slate shingles as shims to fill in the gaps. And somehow through that, because the cost of cutting that slate was so much, the contractors saved, they believe, $200,000 just in that little detail, which we actually love just because of the kind of textural quality of that. But it was a real lesson in the economics of masonry. And another little detail, which we'll share, just this last one, is in the adjacent shingle buildings, they had this kind of moment where these two systems, this shingle system came down to this stone base. And it's one that we really kind of enjoyed and incorporated in. We call it the bell bottom. We incorporated into this wall. You can just see at the bottom of where these two systems come together, this kind of jaunty edge. And here's the final product from the non-baseball field side. And here's the kind of finale of the story for us. This is the kind of happy ending. The Swarthmore baseball team, which had been pretty mediocre for centuries, maybe. The very first year of the completion of this building went on to win the Division III championship. So, for us, it's like one of those testaments to the virtue of design.
And we take full responsibility for that, by the way. So if the Hokies are looking for a little improvement with their teams, there's a simple answer. Really, that space up there is one that, I think, for us, there are these moments in our projects when we look back and, creating spaces where there weren't spaces before or places for people that they inhabit and enjoy is the part that I think is really, really meaningful for us. And this is kind of a found programmatic element that was not part of the original program, but one that became very important. So the next two projects we're going to show, and that's what we're going to finish up on, are two projects that are in progress. And so we'll kind of move through these quickly. But the first one is a competition that we won. It was an international competition for study of housing typologies in Northwest Arkansas. There's tremendous growth happening there, and they're struggling with that growth and what it means to house all of the transplants that are moving into the Bentonville area, which is being driven by Walmart's growth. That's where the headquarters of Walmart are, down in Bentonville, Arkansas. And so this competition, what you're seeing here on the screen, is one of the final renderings that we submitted for that competition. But this is the multifamily typology is not one before this project that we had a great deal of experience with. We do now. We've actually been doing many multifamily projects, but it's one that's driven there. You can kind of see these different versions of this kind of building all over the place, all over the country. It's a podium type construction. You have different construction types stacked on top of each other. It's one of the idiosyncrasies of our code is that we allow for a different building construction type on the lower level or two levels, and then wood frame construction. As long as you put a separation between that, it's almost like, oh, it's two separate buildings in terms of the way the code looks at it. But it's an idiosyncrasy, and it's one that we began to just question in this competition. How might that articulate itself and land in a different context where you aren't just extruding these two buildings up and allow that lower building, that lower level, to disengage and be not exactly reflective of the buildings above and create different kinds of spaces for parking, for people, move the landscape up and down through those buildings. So we looked at that. On the left, you see that, the typical podium, and what we're calling the Ozark podium is this smash up of the local park, on-grade parking with kind of a more dynamic typology. And so these are a series of sections as you go through from the street, and you can kind of see some of the housing elements facing that street, and then parking beyond it, between it, how that parking level might be assembled with, in this competition entry, it was kind of precast tees, but opening it up and letting landscape move in and out of it. So it's not just parking underground, building above, but it's an intertwining and intermixing of these two elements, and then various engagements of the natural waterways that happen to be on the site. The other place that we really locked into in terms of our competition was how to take what was the vernacular housing in the Ozarks, and from this single pen log cabin and the way that they would grow over time into double pens and then add on to become a central hall. And then, of course, if you could build your full house, you would do that. And so we took just simple formal language and began to turn those into icons that we arranged around this site to create buildings that had spaces between for people, below, above. The landscape would move up and in between those. And originally in this early design concept, we would have holes and portals down into the parking area, but it was they were rather small, and you'll see as it moves forward that those grew over time for economic and other reasons, which kind of improved the design. But these are all competition entries, renderings, and then the spaces in between, which kind of would create small kind of urban living environments, but for the multifamily intermixed with retail and public space. So these were the kind of ideas we were exploring. And certainly, I think for us, one of the things that we really recognize in the multifamily buildings typology is that path that you have to take every day as you go from your car into your apartment and back and forth, whether it's a car or not, but you're moving in and out. And so this is one that we paid a lot of attention to. Some early study models that we began after we won the competition and began to move into further design. This is again, you know, we kind of make these models and studied the different articulation of the building. And this is kind of some of the construction drone shots of where it lands in a neighborhood in Bentonville, and kind of us, the way we tried to articulate the scale from the outer edges with smaller buildings in towards the center where it would grow. Very simple construction and materiality that is created a language for these buildings. So this has been moving along, and certainly you can see here some of those parking openings and the articulation of that. So this is the construction of this has been slow, and the pandemic certainly slowed it down, but it's looking to be finished in October of this year. But some of the first folks will be moving into the first 100 units, because it's different buildings like this. They can phase it in the coming months. And here you're starting to see that articulation of the upper landscape and the lower level where the parking is. So should be an interesting and dynamic series of spaces. Okay, final project, just to give you a highlight of what's coming. This is a project at Princeton University, a renovation and addition to one of their historic gymnasium projects, and subtle interventions on the existing building on one side of the campus with an addition on the back side. A strong sense of trying to find ways with a contemporary language to connect to the existing language of those historic neo-Gothic, collegiate Gothic buildings. And I think one of the, certainly always thinking about a budget on any project, but at Princeton, we do get to use slightly more exotic materials, and here we have a bronze screen that you're seeing on the upper level, and a great deal of care and attention to the detailing of this building. So construction's ongoing, and the interior space is one that is taking on a lot of renovation. So this is more of just a preview of what's one of our current projects currently under construction today. So with that, we'll shift to questions.
Oh, yeah.
Hello. Okay. Could you talk a little bit more about the way that you approach engaging with the communities that you work with, and why you might take a different approach than maybe a typical firm would, and how you have it be a more participatory process?
You ready to go? I'm going to let Mark answer this.
Okay.
He seems ready.
I think that, again, this kind of goes back to that, the DNA of our firm, which was really established in that first project, and one that, the realization that we don't have all the answers, and that typically, if we are good listeners and we allow for input, ideas, and critical thinking to enter the process, it allows for better solutions in the end. And so one of the biggest issues I think we find when we engage on a project is there's a program, and the project is identified, the problem of the project, so to speak, or the brief of the project is established by the client early on, but that actually may not be the brief. That may not be the true problem of the project. And many of the projects that we showed throughout the day today is those were not the initial questions that were being asked of us or the initial project brief. And so that process of engagement, so that involves having focus groups, having conversations, charrettes, bringing models actually are one of the best, most democratic kind of ways to engage on a project and bring others in. A lot of people, your clients and others, don't understand drawings, so models are a really great tool to actually talk about designs because it allows anyone and everyone to engage and talk about it. So we try to do that. And so it's really a big part of our effort early on is to try to understand what the real problem is. There's always the project brief and the program and all the other elements, but what are the real problems and questions associated with a project? And that's kind of a big part of the engagement.
Hi, hello. Really beautiful work. This might be a redundant question, but why is your firm called DIGSAU?
That's an interesting question, actually, because there's a bit of an evolution to it. Originally, it was an amalgamation of the four partners' names. So there's a guy named Dingle, there's a Goldstein, there's a Sanderson, there's an Unkefer. Along the way, we've kind of moved away from that. It would have been a lot. We liked the fact that it was a word that didn't exist, and therefore, even though our names were embedded in it, over time that's become a lot less important. And our hope is that the legacy of DIGSAU won't be about us. And it's interesting that you bring that up because I was screwing around with ChatGPT recently, and I was sort of astounded to see that it had come up with a new anagram for DIGSAU was Design Integrated Group for Sustainability, Architecture, and Urbanism. And so I thought, oh, that's not so bad. Maybe that's where we're going.
So I find it really cool how much nonprofit work that you guys have and that you've demonstrated here. So could you talk a little bit more about your experience with nonprofit versus profit, and do you find it more enjoyable to work with nonprofits or to work with normal profit organizations?
You should have gone to Kevin's professional practice class earlier, but I think we find it very rewarding to work with nonprofits. We obviously have to balance everything we do with the kind of business of architecture, but I think what we would say is that nonprofits are mission-driven clients. We really look for mission-driven clients in every, in all the work that we do. So, the nonprofits just happen to be more directly mission-driven. And even when working with developers, we look for developers that are kind of being driven by a mission that isn't just how much money can we make on something, but really how can we use design to elevate the experience of this project. And so that's kind of the measure that has guided our decision-making around projects. It's easy to feel pretty good working for a nonprofit, though, and no question about it.
And I would just add that I think it offers opportunities for creative solutions that, there's not always a clear answer for how to reflect a nonprofit's mission in the building and the architecture. And so that kind of process of discovery and questioning is one that we think leads to a lot of interesting results.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture and showing us your beautiful work, first of all. And I was wondering more about your research process when approaching and tackling your very specific problems for your projects.
I would say true researchers would absolutely say no. I think it does a disservice for folks who really delve in methodical and process-driven research. I think, but what we do try to do is bring a level of inquiry and process into each of the projects, and we try to, whether it's through focus groups and having various design charrettes, or whether it's through research and trying to find the fundamentals that we can underpin a project to, I think is something that we really invest time in. And we do, when we do have to present to clients and say, well, what is your expertise? I think what we like to answer that question with is that it's process driven, that I think our expertise is in the design process. We can't tell you exactly where the design is going to lead or where the project's going to lead, but we have faith in the process that it will lead to somewhere.
Hi, thanks for coming. We know what kind of pleasure it is to work with Noah, so thank you. I was curious exactly what qualities do you look for when you're trying to vet for a client? Which people do you send over to try and convince a client to use a certain material or to rethink a certain problem?
We don't have a specific methodology, and I think we feel like everybody in the firm is a pretty good spokesperson. So there's no real strategy around that. It's and maybe to a fault. I think more corporate sort of business development folks would think that it's a little haphazard. But there's not. I think we're all out there in the world engaging and asking questions and getting to know people, and over time those relationships can lead to a project, and they come in from every direction, and so that's kind of how things happen. Sometimes we have to step it up a little more and get out there a little more often, but
and I'm not sure if this is answering the question, but I think for us the design process goes through many iterations, and you don't land on the material early on in the process quite often. I think for us, what's most important is understanding what we want the materials to do, what we want the level of engagement to be, what are the qualities of that material, and then it allows us to be much more facile and fluid to figure out how we apply different materials to achieve those goals. And so that will allow us to be open to partnerships and other paths in the construction process, because we're not designing directly around a particular material, but we're designing around the intent.
Thank you for your lecture. So I think in a lot of the work that you showed us, there's sort of an emphasis on the exterior articulation of the wall. Can you talk about how that sort of, finds its way into the interior walls, maybe through materiality or anything like that?
It's a great question, and I think we try to apply the same principles. I will say, I think over the years, if we had to be a little self-critical, I think it's that a lot of the focus is in the walls, on the outside of the walls, and we're getting better and better at sort of focusing on the interior spaces. A lot of times they're fairly kind of like the Clay Studio spaces. They're fairly kind of raw industrial spaces, which we like. But I think the same design principles hold true for there isn't an interior or an exterior kind of division. We don't break projects down in those ways, we try to kind of bring the same line of thinking that we bring to the exterior to the interior. I do think it's a place we could do a little better, and it is a place we're working to do more on.
Thank you.
I think you should try, like, people in the back should raise their hand, and then people up front should raise their hand over here so that Noah has to run up and down the stairs a few more times before you leave. There you go. That's the spirit.
Thank you for the lecture. I had a question. What would you recommend for like student projects? Because obviously a lot of the variables you worked with your work like kind of require like real world experiences, and it's kind of hard to like replicate that in student work. So I was wondering what you'd recommend we sort of focus on with our designs.
Well, I think what I would say is you're doing, for large measure, you're doing it. I see a lot of materials around the studio. I see a lot of, you're getting your hands on different elements, and that's a really difficult and broad question to kind of have a smooth answer to. But I would say that one of the things that we certainly learn in professional practice is that not every project has to do everything. So get on a particular project, achieving something or a hierarchy of one or two, three things is enough. And then some of those ideas or explorations you can save for future work and future. And so I think early on, I think we all as designers are trying to, have it all, to have the designs do everything. And I think just a little bit of discipline and restraint leads to actually more poignant and interesting results in the end than trying to have, everything do every design do everything.
And I would echo what Mark said. When we had the privilege of sitting in on one of Patrick Studio's pinups yesterday and just seeing the work, I mean, what we're seeing here is really encouraging in terms of the kind of materiality that you guys seem to be bringing to the work in the studio and just the exploration around materials. It's not that common in architectural education these days. I think there, as I said at the beginning, there is an increased reliance on sort of digital modeling to be the kind of tool and the primary form of expression and the primary engagement in an architecture project, and we see it in our own practice, and we're resisting it. So I think there is just a kind of a tangible physical kind of reality to working with materials and the way we experience spaces, and you just need to keep remembering that and exploring that as part of the process. And I think it seems like it's happening here, which we find really inspiring. There you go. You gotta just let them go all the way around.
You guys really took Jamie's advice to heart.
So I was intrigued by when you mentioned working with the material manufacturer for your Matchbox project, and I was curious what you would say was probably if there was sort of a main thing in that process of working with a manufacturer that that got them to kind of go with your work and take a risk on that, on your project, and dealing with that, because that sounded very creative to bring in a material that wouldn't otherwise be available through that kind of relationship. So what was kind of crucial there to forming that?
So I wish there were a better answer, but there's a little bit of luck and serendipity there. I think you reach out, you make a lot of connections, and in that particular case, we eventually, after many attempts, found a manufacturer that had built a new plant in Pittsburgh from Europe. They had capacity. Our project was a little bit smaller, so it was easy for them to kind of foot some of the bill on it without a lot of costs on their part, and and just kind of drew them in to the project. But I don't know that there's a one size fits all to that, but I think it's a little bit of doggedness in terms of chasing those things down and trying to find people who are willing to help. And more times than not, we eventually land on someone, but not every time.
Thank you.
Hey, I was just curious if you guys have any specific examples of working with rather like some sort of board or university architect or somebody who's an authority that is really resisting some of your novel ideas.
Yeah. We unfortunately face that impediment quite often, and it's discouraging. But I think we're kind of dedicated to just continuing to push the ideas we believe in, and I think make an effort to see if others can find engagement and see some of the same things that we do. But that's a reality of the world we're all in, and you'll be moving out into, is that there is a lot of clear and set mindsets, and in all sorts of different arenas. And so trying to break free from that, really takes some energy. And that's what we do. Yeah, thank you very much. This is really fun.